Welcome to the Manufacturing Matters podcast with the Council of Industry. Join us as we bring you inspiring stories, interviews, and insights from across the Hudson Valley that will revolutionize the way you think about manufacturing. This podcast is proudly sponsored by PKF O'Connor Davies, a leading accounting and advisory firm dedicated to helping businesses thrive in the manufacturing sector. With their industry knowledge and strategic guidance, PKF O'Connor Davies ensures that manufacturers have the financial insights and support they need to achieve success.
Adam Bosch, president of Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress. Welcome to the Council of Industry podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Harold.
So, Pattern for Progress, tell us a little bit about the organization and what your role is in the Hudson Valley community.
Yeah, sure. So Pattern for Progress, we've been around since 1965. We were founded back then by the region's academic, business, nonprofit leaders, as well as the county planning departments were involved back then. And back then, if you go back in history, the 60s in the Hudson Valley, there were a lot of things going on. You had sprawl, right, coming out of New York City. You had urban renewal happening in our urban centers, which was a bad thing. You had the seeds of innovation being planted at places like IBM. You even had the first sort of beginnings of the environmental movement, which of course started here in the region and then spread nationwide. But the biggest thing that was happening then was actually the United States Army getting ready to sell Stewart Airport into private hands.
Right.
And it was that, action that really prompted the region's civic leaders to say, we need an independent, nonpartisan research and planning organization that can look at these issues like the sale of a Stewart Airport and help us figure out what's in it for the region. How can we capitalize this? How can we use this opportunity for improving the quality of life, sparking the right kind of economic growth? And so it was those sorts of things in mind that Pattern was founded. And in fact, our first project ever was the first master plan for Stewart Airport. We continued to work on transportation and infrastructure as our main topics for quite a while. And nowadays, our staff of 6 really wonderful people works on topics like housing and infrastructure and transportation and downtown and community revitalization and really tracking the demographic and economic changes in the Hudson Valley. The idea, Harold, being that as we research these things, as we do the regional planning, we can bring these objective, evidence-based findings to our civic leaders in the region who have the passion and the authority to act on them. That way, those actions are based on a foundation of good knowledge.
Right. I would add that there's almost a consensus built in your research because of the participation of all those different organizations and entities, the diverse groups around that mission of regionalism and planned growth.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's important in our work that we reach out to the entire region and not just one subset of the region, because the things that we tend to research, the things that we tend to do planning for, really have a region-wide effect, whether that's, looking at some of the new state monies for infrastructure and whether they're reaching our communities. That affects everybody. Whether it's the ongoing housing crisis in the region, that affects everybody, right? So we really try to make the tent as big as we can because we're oftentimes working on issues that affect every corner of the region and not one subset of it or another.
Right. So some of those, you mentioned some of those issues right there: housing, transportation, childcare. These are things whenever we're traveling and speaking with our members, like these are always the issues that crop up when they talk about their workforce and the challenges around hiring people and maintaining their workforce. So I think this might be something that might be a little bit more of your focus, about a little bit more of the implementation of strategies as well. Once you do the research, how do we actually get from this is a good idea, this is the problem, this is a possible solution, how do we actually implement that solution?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of the best examples that's happening right now is going back a year ago, we completed a study that looked at 10 years of investments in road, bridge, water, and sewer infrastructure across the region. And it looked at local, state, federal investments, the whole spectrum. And one of the things that we found is that the state government has allocated since 2015 a lot of money toward water and sewer infrastructure.
Hmm.
It's approaching $6 billion at this
Wow.
point. And of that money, only about 15 to 20% of it has actually reached communities across the state. Okay, that seems not great, right?
Right.
So first question is why, right? And when we dug into it and we talked with probably almost three dozen different communities across the region, small, medium, and large cities, villages, rural towns, what we learned is that it's really the disbursement model that the state is using that's preventing it from reaching those communities. So it's a very complex model. You got to figure out how to get low or no interest financing or bond it on your own, figure out the loan forgiveness piece. It's very difficult if you're not a community that has a planner and an engineer and a grants department. If you're just one of our typical Hudson Valley towns with a part-time
Right.
lawmakers, it's
Right.
next to impossible to figure out how to get to this money. So your question was, how do we turn that into action? Well, guess what? Lawmakers don't exactly love it when you come and show them that all of this money they allocated for a very good and worthwhile purpose, right? This infrastructure goes right to the heart of the protection of public health.
Right.
When you show them that that money that they allocated is not reaching their people, that's a problem, right?
Right.
So we have actually brought those findings to our lawmakers, to the governor's office, and said not only that this is a problem, but here are three things you could do about it to get that money flowing into these medium and small size communities more easily. Because right now, a lot of them are putting their hand up and going, yeah, we're not trying because this money's not for us.
Right.
No, 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 no. The
It
money
should be.
is for them. That, I mean, it's for them as much as it is for any other community. They just don't have the bandwidth, the technical expertise, or the time to figure out how to get to it. And that's where a group like Pattern steps in and tries to help.
And so it's a, I assume you have some grant funding, but it is a privately funded organization as well. There's support there.
Yeah, sure. So our organization we're a nonprofit membership corporation. So we have about 200 members, mostly companies and nonprofits across the region, but also some individuals and some government entities that pay annual dues to be members of Pattern. We put on events throughout the year. We do what's called directed research, where a local government or a nonprofit or a business can come to us with a specific research question, and we will apply the same rigorous objective process to their research project that we would to something we came up with independently. And that's sort of how we get our funding to pay our staff that carries out the research and planning we do throughout the course of an average year.
I should point out that you mentioned all the founding organizations of Pattern for Progress. The Council of Industry was one of those not-for-profits at the table back in 1965. My predecessor was there, and I know we are very proud of our long-term engagement with the organization and always very supportive of what you're trying to do. So I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with several Pattern presidents. I think 4 in my time, maybe 5. Tell us a little bit about your path to this role and your rather fascinating careening career to this
I
point.
mean, the short version of it is I was born and raised in Newburgh, went to Walkable High School, went to engineering school, later got my degree in journalism and spent the first about 12 to 13 years of my career as a newspaper reporter. Most of that time was spent at the Times Herald Record, did a lot of investigative reporting while I was there, spent a period of time at the New York Times Albany Bureau. And then I actually came to Pattern for 1 year in 2011 as vice president of research and worked on some really interesting projects with the CEO at the time, Jonathan Drapkin, and Robin DeGroat and Joe Chaika and Sarah Brannon and other people who were working at Pattern at the time. Left Pattern after a year and actually went and worked at the New York City water supply system for 10 years. I was the director of public affairs, education, intergovernmental outreach for the largest municipal water supply in the country. And the thing about that job was it allowed me to combine, the knowledge I gained during engineering school with the essential skills of journalism, which are to take very complicated things and translate them into language my mother can understand, right? I mean, that's essentially what I did. And then from there came back to Pattern in my current role as president and CEO. And the thing that's interesting about the route I took to get here is that if you're going to do this job well, you really need to understand how the world works. And both, when I was a journalist in my earliest days, in my early 20s, I sat through a lot of planning board meetings, through a lot of zoning
Right. I was
board
going to say.
meetings. And there's really no better education if you want to understand civics than sort of watching it 4 nights a week, when it's working, when it's not working. And then actually going from covering government, covering courts, covering crime, covering the environment, covering West Point, to then sort of being inside one of the largest government agencies in the country, I really got a full sort of 360-degree perspective of how our civic society works. And so coming back here to Pattern, I've been able to use, I think, that knowledge to really say, what can we do and how can we apply our research and planning in a way that can pull on those strings of power to help them make good decisions on behalf of the region.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. I mean, I fully appreciate the fact that, particularly at the the municipal level, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, and a lot of the implementation of infrastructure projects, as you just talked about, and all kinds of public policy projects as well. So tell us what's Pattern working on now? What are the priorities that your board is telling you, or that you're seeing that the region needs to be focused on?
Yeah, so I would say that housing kind of remains topic number one. And it's topic number one because housing really affects so many of the other things that we're seeing across the region. And so if I had to break it down, there's a few things going on in the Hudson Valley simultaneously that are really going to determine the future of our region, the future of our communities, the future of our demographics and our workforce. And I'll just say it really leads off with housing. What's happened over the past 5 years is that the cost of a home, a typical single family home that you'd want to go out and buy, has sprinted away from people much faster than people can try to catch up to it. So across the region, over just the past 5 years, we've seen the median price of a single family home, generally speaking, increase somewhere between 40 and 110%.
Wow.
The one that doubled is Sullivan County. It's the only county in the region that's seen its median price double, but counties like Greene and Ulster and Columbia and even Dutchess to some degree have seen theirs go up by 60 to 80%. And what that does, Harold, is it really means that people who typically would have graduated from rentals into home ownership are now increasingly stuck in those rentals for an amount of time yet to be determined. And the reason they're sort of stuck there is because we have not built the same quantity of housing for this generation that we did for my parents' generation or for my grandparents' generation. In fact, over the past 15 years, we've only built 0.45 units of housing for every job that we attracted. So that's a little less than a half unit of housing for every job that we attracted across the region. So that not only means that housing costs are going up because the supply is not meeting the demand, but as housing prices go up and other costs in New York go up, we are increasingly seeing people leave the region. So we have lost more people from the region than we've gained for 24 out of the last 25 years. The net loss has been about 134,000 people. 97 of our 120 school districts right now are actively shrinking, most of them by somewhere around 20% or more. And so the housing challenge, the affordability challenge, creates a population challenge in which our region is headed long term, as you look in the data, toward a smaller and smaller population. So if you look at the ages of 0 to 5, 5 to 10, right, they're thousands of people smaller now than they were just 5, 10 years ago.
Wow.
And if you roll that forward, right, the housing problem creates this demographic problem. The demographic problem creates a workforce problem. Because what we have now in the region is that if you take our workforce, which you would define as people between the ages of 25 and 65, that's the prime working age group, and you cut that in half, the older half outnumbers the younger half by about 100,000 people.
And those are the folks that are in a home, right? They've got in before maybe, or are established, right? And I see
that's
that.
right. And if you think about what that means, what that really means is that for every person who is retiring, for every baby boomer generation worker in the region that is now retiring and leaving the labor pool, there is only a fraction of a person replacing that retiree on the other end of the labor pool. And, it's hard for people to maybe understand this, but I want them to think of it this way. If you think about your daily life, you have seen this workforce stress, this workforce challenge in ways that affect you. If you called up your doctor's office to try to make an appointment for an annual physical and they told you they were scheduling 9 to 10 months out, that is a symptom of our housing shortage and our population loss and our workforce challenges. Same thing goes for if you went to a diner and they had a sign up that says, please excuse the slow service because we're understaffed, which I've seen probably half a dozen times in the region recently. That's a symptom of it, right? There's all sorts of these symptoms sprinkled across the region in practically every single industry sector we have.
I mean, just to put it into terms for manufacturers, I'm sure people are listening. And in our world, it translates into longer lead times, or actually leaving orders on the table, let alone not entering into new markets and expanding. It's palpable in the bottom line, and it's extremely frustrating. And it is interesting as you describe it. It's so obvious as you describe it, but it's not necessarily intuitive.
And if you think of it, really, these are good terms, I think, for manufacturers too, right? We can think of our region in terms of inputs and outputs, right? There's only 3 inputs that get you more people, okay? One of them is births, right? Our births in pretty much every county across the region are down somewhere between 20 and 35% compared to 1997, okay? Wow. So that's not going back up. The second one would be migration. Migration is the movement of people state by state and county by county throughout the country. And I just told you we've lost 24 of the past 25 years people to migration. And the only other one is immigration, and that's people moving into the country and into the region from elsewhere. So, our long-term demographics and our long-term workforce is tied to those 3 things: births, migration, and immigration. We know we're losing steadily on 2 of them, and the third one is out of our control, and the federal government that can't figure out anything. So it's a real challenge for the region. And when we look at the data, we see very concerning signs that show this challenge gets more painful over the next 10 to 20 years.
So it almost seems counterintuitive that a lack of housing could cause that, because it feels like, why would I, as you described that, an outward migration, why would I build any housing here if the region is bleeding?
Well, it's a great question, Harold, and it is counterintuitive, so I'll try to explain it. There are 3 things, there are more than 3, but there are 3 central things where people might go, hey, if we're losing folks, why do we need more housing? Well, here's why. A lot of our housing currently is off the market because a lot of the housing has been gobbled up by short-term rentals or second homeowners. So a segment of our housing is just off the table. You go to a place like Tannersville in Greene County, or even certain parts of Ulster County, you probably have a significant proportion of the overall housing stock locked up in short-term rentals through Airbnb or a similar service, right? So our denominator is changing when it comes to housing, right? Because those are not available to us anymore. The other thing that's happening is the average size of the family is getting smaller. So for a second, if we want to argue that the region's population is flat, right? So the pie is the same size. As the family goes from being 4, 5, or 6 people to really 3 or 4 people, what it means is that that pie is getting cut up into smaller and smaller slices, and each of those slices needs a housing unit. So what we see in the data is people are not having families with 3 or 4 kids anymore. It's mostly ones and twos. Okay. And that means even if you have the same population, the average size of the family is smaller, which means there's more families, which means there's more family units, which means there's a need then for more housing units to house them.
Right. So you guys have been looking at this. What are and you're a person who's attended many a planning board meeting, and you've seen local zoning ordinances and master plans put in place, and all the I'm going to call it bureaucracy or red tape that goes into building a housing development, or whatever you want to call it. How do you solve it? How do you incentivize communities to put housing in? How do you incentivize builders to build them? I mean, and just one quick point here is for decades, I heard people complain that they didn't want development in their towns because they didn't want to add population to the schools. Like we're bursting at the seams already. But from what you're describing, the schools all seem to be bleeding pupils.
Yeah, it's what I call the biggest myth in the Hudson Valley. I mean, this idea that we can't afford development because we can't afford kids in the schools is an argument that is a false argument, and it is an argument that will lead to the hollowing out of our communities and the expedited disappearance of our workforce. So anyone who says that, frankly, needs to stop. We have 5 entire counties where every single school district in the 5 entire counties is shrinking by more than 20%.
Wow.
Like, we should be on our knees praying for a hailstorm of children. We need them direly.
Right.
But one of the things, you mentioned zoning, right? One of the big challenges here for the Hudson Valley and for other parts of New York is that housing is a regional challenge. It is a regional problem. And it is a regional challenge whose most powerful tool for solving it lies in the hands at the local level, lies in the elected officials at the town, city, and village level, and that's zoning, right? Zoning is not sexy, it's not exciting, it's not fun to talk about, but guess what? Zoning decides what we can build, where we can build it, and how much of it we can build. So when you want to look at the very, pun intended, foundation of what determines where we can build housing, it's zoning. And a lot of our zoning across the region is outdated. It hasn't been updated in some cases decades. It's old, what we call Euclidean zoning. Euclidean zoning is when we would say housing and residential goes over here, and industrial goes in some other corner of the town, and commercial goes in some other corner of the town. And that sort of zoning was really set up when the automobile became popular, so that people could drive around and park in gigantic parking lots and everything was spread out. And the other reason for it was industrial uses back then, manufacturing uses, were seen as, potentially a threat to public health or noise or other things. So they wanted to keep it far away from the housing, from the residential area. But that's not the case anymore. I mean, the case now is that the most successful communities we see around the state and around the Northeast are co-locating their residential, industrial, and commercial uses in sort of more like a town square, hamlet, village type setting, where you're creating places where people can walk not only to work, but walk to the local restaurant and the local grocery store and all that sort of stuff. If you look at the states that surround us, we are by and large the worst at understanding this. For example, in Vermont, if you have a water and sewer district, you are required to set zoning for at least 5 units per acre. If we try to do that here in New York, people will come out with white knuckles, right?
Sure.
In Massachusetts, they are required, each township is required to have a certain percentage of its township zoned for multifamily uses, multifamily dwellings, or the entire township is zoned for that as of right. Again, that would cause mutiny here in New York.
Right.
And yet, our neighbors are doing it. And guess what? When we look at the data, those 134,000 people we've lost, Guess where most of them are going now?
Yeah, right next door.
Just over the border into the
Right.
neighboring states, because they're building housing when we are not.
Yeah, and well, it makes sense too from a just an aesthetic point of view, right? I mean, you concentrate it leaves more open space, it leaves things more agriculture in place. It does a lot of those things if you do it that way.
Now, Harold, I mean, I am sympathetic to the fact that these tools lie in the hands of our local leaders, but our local leaders work 40 hours a week on a
Right,
job that isn't being on the town board or the
right,
village board. So it's a little unfair in a sense that we are asking someone who works at the local grocery store or a trucking company or a medical facility to, after 40 hours of work, sit down and think about the finer points of zoning and density and all the complex issues that come with them. It's really, really hard to do. But, that's where now, again, an organization like Pattern can come in and say, hey, here's what the best practices are across the state and across the Northeast. Here's what we see working. Here are the sorts of zoning and codes and regulations and incentives that are enticing the development of more housing at the right price point for our people. And then it really just relies on the local level to act on that good information. But the bottom line is we do need to act in more places because we got to sort of open up the market for housing to be developed.
right. So you mentioned that this is kind of the core, and things are flowing from that core. You know, what else are you working on?
Yeah, I mean, we're
Yeah,
working on a lot of other things.
obviously it's presenting other things, right?
Yeah, I'll highlight two things. One is from sort of our directed research pile, and one's from our independent research pile. Harold, you'll know well, we were just selected by the state to rewrite the strategic plan for the Mid-Hudson Regional Economic Development Council. Now, most folks out there in plain language will know that as the group that scores the CFA applications, right? So,
Yes.
for those of you who have submitted an application through the consolidated funding application for ESD capital grants or Restore New York or any number of programs, what lies behind that is a plan that was put together in 2011 and then modified a few times that said, here are the priorities and here are the strategies for things that we want the state to fund in certain priority sectors and certain, articulated strategies in the Mid-Hudson Valley to stimulate economic growth, attract jobs, and revitalize our communities. And that plan has been in place for a long time. And the state said this year, we're going to hire folks to update those plans to reflect the realities of 2023, which are very different than what they were in 2011. So we are rewriting that, and that's going to sort of create a new playbook for people who want to apply for various supportive funds through the state, through Empire State Development. It's also going to change the way that the Economic Development Council scores those applications against a new set of criteria. And we're pretty happy to be working in that on behalf of the region with the region.
That's a big project, and I think it's very important. I've been involved in around economic development, peripherally for all of my time here, my 3 decades at the Council of Industry, and Pattern sort of has been, because it's for smart growth and planning, has kind of been around as well. Economic development's really changed, and it's I think some of the measurements and some of the priorities are outdated. And I think particularly in the manufacturing community, you'll hear people say, really, why do you want to attract minimum wage jobs when instead we should be attracting jobs that pay higher wages, that are providing higher value add, that are contributing more greatly to the community. And that maybe is a focus more on the high tech sector or capital investments or things that are going to be along those lines. So I think it's really important work, and I'm glad you guys are doing it and doing it in a thoughtful way.
And as you look through that old plan, Harold, to your point, some of those old strategies are outdated for weird reasons or bad reasons, and some of them are outdated for good reasons. I'll give you an example of both. For instance, in the original plan, it called for the development of non-mandated programs to foster green development. Can you imagine in 2023 if we said that green development was non-mandated? It just kind of
Right.
sounds strange in
Sure.
the context of climate
Right.
change and the way it's
Well,
affecting us now, right?
and the billions of dollars being spent by the federal government in that
Yeah,
regard, right? How
yeah.
maybe words like how can we better access
And a good
and take
example of how
advantage
it's
of it.
out. Yeah, exactly. And a good example of how it's outdated is I'll give you two on this. One, in the original plan, it listed the bad condition of the Tappan Zee Bridge as a major threat to the region. Well, okay, pat ourselves on the back. We
Done.
overcame that threat. We built a new bridge. And it mentioned the Pfizer campus in Pearl River and the IBM campuses in East Fishkill and Kingston
Okay.
as places that we needed to revitalize. And guess what? The good news is that those have either been revitalized or are actively in the
Right.
process of being revitalized. So
Right.
there's some good reasons that
Yeah.
that plan is outdated too.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So, and I think you were going to mention another one that you're working on,
Yeah.
directed and non-directed.
Yeah, the other one, the bit of independent research that we're working on, and this comes from me going around last year and talking to a whole bunch of civic leaders across the region. The one topic that came up in every single conversation I had was childcare. And
Hmm.
when I talk about childcare, I'm really talking about childcare from the standpoint of availability and affordability, right? So availability and cost. Is it there at all? And can we afford it? Can our
Hmm.
workers afford it? And so, Pattern, we decided to jump in and really study childcare in the region, the underlying regulations, the way it's changed over time, the way that the cost of childcare affects the affordability of housing, the affordability of just living here in the region. And we're doing some really interesting things. So we know, for example, that over the past 15 years, the number of childcare businesses in many parts of the region have shrunk significantly.
Hmm.
And I can just tell you one example. When I worked at the city water supply, I worked out in Grahamsville in Sullivan County. There was a provider there that closed. And then many of my colleagues were then left driving all the way to Liberty, which is like an hour round trip
Jeez.
just to bring their kids to childcare so they could get their workday started, right? So we are mapping that, right? We are going to map that as a function of a couple things. We're going to map childcare centers as a function of geography, as a function of population density, as a function of drive time. So how far does the
Hmm.
population have to drive to get to the nearest childcare center? And we're also going to map it as a function of universal pre-K. And one of the reasons we're going to do that is one of the unexpected, unintended consequences of universal pre-K is that when you take the 4-year-olds out of the child care center and you put them into the schools in universal pre-K, it really can be a mortal wound to the child care center.
Interesting.
Because in the child care centers, those 4-year-olds actually are the greatest source of revenue
Right.
because 18 months and younger, the ratio is 2 children
Very intense.
to
Right.
every caretaker, right?
Right.
And
Very
then once you
intense.
get up to 4 years old, it's either one for every 10 or one for every 12. So you take those kids out of those centers, all you're left with are the most expensive kids to care for, and it
Right.
really flips your business model upside down, right?
Interesting.
So Cornell did a study across the state that showed a significant uptick in the closure of childcare centers in places where UPK was expanded
Hmm.
significantly, and the districts didn't program some of that money out to the childcare centers. So, we're looking at all these things, and in the end, what we're going to do is come back with a set of recommendations to the state, to local governments, to our even our federal officials who have been subsidizing childcare with money
Sure.
to the states to say this is really the model we should pursue. These sets of ideas would help improve the conditions for childcare. Because again, Harold, bringing it back to your members, you know, if you can't find childcare that's affordable, right now it averages about $1,300 to $1,400 a month for one child in the region. You can't get to work. You have a hard time hiring people. People go out on maternity leave. They go to come back. Maybe they can't find a provider, or they find that the
Right.
provider would cost them 85% of their salary. I mean, why
Sure.
would they come back?
Why would they
So,
come back?
so it
Yeah.
exacerbates the workforce issue along with our desire to make sure kids get a good jump start on early childhood education.
Right. Also important. So yeah, and it kind of goes to the interesting name of the organization and patterns for progress, but there are so many like patterns within this data and information and interconnectivity that it is fascinating. Adam Bosch, president of Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate your time and appreciate all the work that you do for the region.
I appreciate you, Harold, and everyone from the council industry. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Manufacturing Matters, brought to you by the Council of Industry and sponsored by PKF O'Connor Davies, accountants and advisors who understand the unique challenges and opportunities in the manufacturing sector. We hope you gained valuable insights and inspiration from today's discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform.